Hello and welcome to the Mountebank History of Scotland series with me, Daniel Downey. I am a comedian based in Edinburgh. I have a master's degree in Scottish history. I am a historian of Scottish history. And today's episode is all about the last Stuart king, King James VII of Scotland and James II of England and Ireland. James, he became king when his brother Charles II died without a legitimate heir. And Charles II, unlike our current King Charles, opted not to divorce and remarry or, pretend a child that wasn't his was in fact one of his legitimate heirs to the throne. And so, on his death, his brother became king. And the king's brother becoming king was as terrifying a thought in the 17th century as it remains in the 21st century. And that's not because of James's alleged involvement in an international human trafficking ring with a paedophile billionaire, but because of his religion. James was a devout Catholic, and as a Catholic monarch, James was viewed with immediate suspicion by the Protestants, who were fearful that James was going to reverse the Protestant reformations in Britain and that they were going to be subjected to the same persecutions that they had to endure under the reign of the last Catholic monarch in England, Bloody Mary Tudor. King James, he removed the anti-Catholic penal laws in England and Scotland, and he put Catholics in prominent positions of government, which was completely unacceptable to the Protestants because those positions, they were supposed to be exclusively for people who went to Eton. In 1688, James's wife, Mary of Modena, she unexpectedly gave birth to a healthy male heir. James was 54 years old when he fathered his heir, James Francis Edward Stuart, in 1688. And fathering children into your 50s, it has remained a tradition that has been upheld by the Stuarts to this day. Mainly Rod. With a male heir, there was now a clear Catholic succession to the British thrones, and this proved to be the last straw for the GB News viewers who turned to an Orangeman to protect them. Although, they could hardly complain to the orange guy about an unexpected birth, considering it was the orange guy who had made unexpected births illegal in the first place. William, the Dutch Prince of Orange, promised to make Britain great again, and James's days as king, they were numbered. James ruled for less than 2 years before he was usurped by his daughter Mary and his son-in-law William of Orange in the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689. Although, to be fair to James, that is still 15 times longer than Liz Truss managed in charge of the country. Now, if this is the first time that you have watched or listened to the Mountebank History of Scotland series, this is the sort of thing that you should expect, all right? It's mostly jokes about the royal family and lots of Tory bashing. If that sounds like your thing, you're going to enjoy it. If not, I don't know, maybe in our time have done an episode about King James VII and II in which they didn't compare him to Rod Stewart or Liz Truss. I don't know. But anyway, I do hope you enjoyed this episode all about King James. Have fun out there. And I'll see you all on the other side. Enjoy! On the 2nd of February 1685, Charles II fell unexpectedly seriously ill, and in keeping with the conspiratorial obsessions of the era, Charles's illness, it led to rumours that he had been poisoned by his brother James or other Catholic conspirators in an attempt to try and speed up the Catholic succession, which is novel, because normally it's Charles who's desperately waiting for someone to die so that he can become king. He thought he'd hit the jackpot when COVID came along. On his deathbed, Charles II converted to Catholicism via Father John Hamilton, a priest whom he had met during his time on the run in the aftermath of the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Charles II, he died on the 6th of February 1685, and James, at the age of 51 years old, was now King James VII of Scotland and James II of England and Ireland. And no sooner was he on the throne than James faced armed insurrection. In the run-up to Charles's death, there was a lot of tension regarding the Catholic succession, most notably the Rye House plot, which we discussed on last week's episode. And the government knew that the suspected architects of the Rye House plot, that is the Duke of Monmouth and the Earl of Argyll, they would continue to plot against the monarch while they were in exile in the Netherlands. The rebellion the government had feared for so long, it finally came in May 1685 when Argyll sailed from Amsterdam with around 300 men in an unnecessarily protracted sailing. The invasion force sailed north and it stopped in Orkney, a diversion that advertised their position, and it gave James time to prepare for the incoming invasion. They landed at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull on the 11th of May, and it was here where Argyll summoned his Campbell clansmen to his cause. However, there was no great inundation of Campbell clansmen, and by the time Argyll raised his standard in the Campbell Heartlands of Kintyre just a week later, his original force of 300, it had barely even doubled in size. Argyll, he had sent the Covenanting hero William Cleland, the man who had masterminded the Covenanting victory at Drumclog, ahead to link up with the Cameronians. But most of the Cameronian prisoners, they had been transferred to Dunnottar Castle in the episcopal northeast of Scotland, and there remained very few Cameronians for Cleland to actually recruit. The Presbyterians of the southwest, they had been sent to prison in Aberdeen. These days, they're normally just sent up there to work in the oil and gas industry. Well, that and prison, obviously. Cleland, he had been sent to round up support for a side in the southwest of Scotland that was always destined to lose. It was like trying to sell season tickets for Queen of the South. And if Cleland couldn't get the Cameronians to commit, and Argyll couldn't rally his own clansmen to his cause, then surely the entire venture, it was doomed from the beginning. Why then did the Campbells not come out for Argyll? Well, after Argyll had escaped his imprisonment from Edinburgh Castle and made for Holland, the Campbell estates, they had been forfeited by the Crown, and James was able to successfully stir up and harbour anti-Campbell sentiment in the West Highland clans. James knew there were two things the Highlanders of the West Highlands truly hated: Campbells and self-service checkouts. And so he was able to successfully rile them up and encourage them to ravage and pillage the Campbell lands as well as the Sainsbury's locals. James's man in Argyll was John Murray, the Marquis of Atholl, who did a thorough job of enforcing the king's loyalty there. And by the time Argyll arrived back in his homeland, the suppression techniques employed by the government had had their desired effect, and there was very few Campbell clansmen willing to come out for Argyll's cause. Nonetheless, in Campbellton on the 20th of May 1685, Argyll issued a proclamation detailing the unjust treatment of him and his father by King Charles II and James the Duke of York, along with a list of the oppressive acts of government implemented in Scotland since the restoration of 1660. And Argyll's rebellion, it was officially up and running. The aims of Argyll's rebellion were unclear from the start. He himself didn't seem to know whether his aim was to try and overthrow King James VII or to just merely win back the forfeited Campbell lands. Argyll, he didn't know whether to fight north in the Campbell lands or to fight Atholl in the lowlands. And his indecision, it quickly led to the disintegration of his rebellion. He didn't know if he wanted to win the country or just hold on to some power and get back his losses. Argyll, he would have made the perfect leader of the Scottish National Party. And as he struggled to make a decision, his men scattered, and Argyll's already depleted forces, they were left threadbare. Sensing the rebellion's inevitable failure, Argyll, he tried to make his escape, but he was caught, bedraggled and in disguise trying to cross the River Clyde in Glasgow in June 1685. Argyll once again found himself imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle and, having already been tried in absentia, he was swiftly executed, like his father, by means of the Maiden on the 30th of June 1685. Argyll had died the same way as his father. It was tragic and it was ironic. It'd be like if Michael Schumacher's laddie died while he was skiing. It had not even been 2 months since Argyll had left Holland, and his rebellion was now thoroughly suppressed, and his head, like his father's before him, it ended up on the pike on top of the Tolbooth prison on Edinburgh's Royal Mile. James VII's rule in Scotland, it had been tested by one of Scotland's most prominent nobles, and it had now more than stood firm. The defeat of the Argyll rebellion brought an end, more or less, to the killing time in Scotland. There were a few covenanting executions in July 1685, and there was some deportations. But after the defeat of Argyll, there were, for all intent purposes, no further persecutions of the Cameronians. The government's position was simply too strong for the praying societies to be considered any real continuing threat. Despite this, the government, they were still keen to get their hands on the remaining most high-profile covenanting fugitives, especially the leader of the Cameronians, James Renwick. Argyll's rebellion, it had received very little support from the societies, and it wasn't backed by Renwick. Renwick refused to back the rebellion for the typical covenanting reason of theological difference. Argyll was considered very much a moderate Presbyterian by Renwick, and his confused rebellion in Renwick's eyes did not commit fully to the complete overthrow of the monarchy and the reinstatement of the National Covenant and Solemn League. And so Argyll, like all unsuccessful Republican presidential candidates since 2016, was, in Renwick's eyes, just far too moderate to be able to support. Renwick's decision to not back the Argyll rebellion, it received a lot of criticism from Covenanting supporters, and it left Renwick vulnerable to betrayal via the huge sum on his head. During a secret visit to Edinburgh using his alias James Bruce in February 1688, Renwick was betrayed and handed over to the government forces. He was hanged in the city's grass market on the 17th of February 1688. And Renwick, he was the last of the Covenanting martyrs. The killing time was over, and James's position in Scotland, it was never stronger. And better still for the king, his position in England was strengthened when Argyll's incompetent rebellion coincided with an equally disastrous invasion of England led by the Duke of Monmouth from the southwest. Monmouth and Argyll's rebellions were supposed to coincide with each other and split the government forces between Scotland and England. However, it is very difficult to link Scotland and England. I mean, the A1 is basically a single track road, and paying for the train, well, that would have bankrupted both the Monmouth and Argyll rebellions. And so their rebellions came down to the megabus, and that's something that you never want to have to rely on. When Monmouth landed in Lyme Regis in southwest England in June 1685, he had barely launched his invasion when the demoralising news reached him of the defeat of the disastrous Argyll rebellion in Scotland and the execution of his conspiratorial partner. Monmouth, he was able to gather far more recruits to his cause than Argyll ever was, but his army of around 3,000 was comprised almost exclusively of untrained and poorly armed peasants. Monmouth's ragtag army made for Taunton, where he made a declaration denouncing King James VII and II and accusing him of poisoning Charles II. On the 6th of July, 1685, Monmouth took a desperate gamble and he launched an evening raid against royal forces who were camped at Sedgemoor. Monmouth's forces were routed by James's favourite commander, Lord John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, a brilliant military commander and smoker of 20 packets of fags a day. 2 days after his defeat at Sedgemoor, Monmouth, he was found hiding in a hedge disguised as a shepherd. His excuse of being en route to a nativity play, it didn't hold up, what with it being July. And so in Monmouth, he was beheaded in London on the 15th of July, 1685. The easy defeat of both Argyll and Monmouth meant that James's ascension, it was now guaranteed, and his royal authority across his kingdoms was secure. As discussed in earlier episodes, James was a Catholic convert who very much wore his Catholicism on his sleeve, and his ascension to the throne, it created a Catholic problem because James was Catholic, his wife Mary of Modena, she was Catholic, Charles II was a suspected Catholic throughout most of his reign, who also had a Catholic wife and was then received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed, meaning that he died a Catholic. What all this meant was that when James ascended to the throne in 1685, the monarchy was a very Catholic institution. The monarchy is no longer a Catholic institution. If it was, it might go some way to explaining Prince Andrew's interest in minors. But many of James's English subjects, they were fearful that there might be a repeat of the vengeful repression of Protestants that had occurred a century earlier during the reign of Queen Mary Tudor. But the English Parliament, it backed James, and one of its first acts was to pass an Act of Parliament that ensured that the Crown would, and indeed must, follow its natural and legal course of descent, regardless of the heir's religion. It's good to know that the monarchy was a more progressive institution in the 1680s than it is today. James, on his part, he agreed to preserve the established order of church and state, and he promised not to change anything, except maybe the Gulf of Mexico. He stated, "I shall make it my endeavour to preserve this government both in church and state as it is by law established. I know the principles of the Church of England are for monarchy, and the members of it have shown themselves to be good and loyal subjects. Therefore, I shall always be careful to defend and to support it." The extent to which James lived up to this promise to protect the established Church of England is debatable, to say the least, in both England and in Scotland. And James, he's often remembered as a stubborn man who lacked the intelligence and the subtlety necessary to govern his realms effectively through difficult times. But a lot of what has been written about James has been influenced by the victorious Whig historians of the late 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. And there were, in fact, many positives throughout James's reign, which we'll discuss a little bit later on in this episode. And at the beginning of his reign, he was in a strong position, James. He had put down rebellions in both Scotland and England. And in Scotland in particular, James had demonstrated throughout his time as Viceroy of Scotland his ability to strengthen royal authority and enforce loyalty to the Crown in Scotland. James's Test Act may have been ill-advised, but there can be little doubt to his commitment to seeing it through to its necessary conclusion. Scotland at the time of James VII's ascension, it was more securely royalist than at any time throughout the Restoration, and there can be little doubt that his rule in Scotland was in fact successful. James, he's mostly known for being pretty rubbish, but actually when we look back in his reign, it would appear that actually he was pretty decent. He was like David Moyes at Manchester United. One of James's first political moves in Scotland came in 1686 when he offered the Scottish Parliament free trade with England in exchange for a lifting of the penal laws against practising Catholics in Scotland. Basically, if you wanted to cozy up to the English, then you had to start being nice to Catholics. It was a real catch-22 situation for your average Ranger supporter. James's offer, it was rejected by the Scottish Parliament. It was rejected because the Scottish Parliament, it felt that free trade with England was something that it was entitled to anyway. But mostly, the Scottish Parliament, it didn't trust the English Parliament when it came to guaranteeing free trade and free movement of people, considering their track record in desperately placating red-faced gammon cunt like Nigel Farage. But more importantly, many Scots, they viewed James's effort to legalise Catholicism in Scotland as an attempt by him to reverse the Protestant Reformation. And so in response to the Parliament's refusal, James, he dissolved the Scottish Parliament and he used his Privy Council to force through 2 religious indulgences in February and June of 1687. The first indulgence, it allowed Catholics, Presbyterians and Quakers to worship freely in private homes. The second indulgence, it was even more all-encompassing. It was, in fact, the most progressive religious reforms seen anywhere in Britain in the 17th century. James's second indulgence saw a complete indulgence of all religious denominations in Scotland. All of James's Scottish subjects, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Catholic, Quaker, whatever, they were permitted to meet and serve God their own way, be it in private houses, chapels, or places purposely hired or built for that use. This remarkable legislation is viewed quite correctly with admiration by modern ecumenical standards, but for the population of 17th century Scotland, it caused a lot of consternation. The biggest losers were the established Episcopal Church of Scotland. James's religious legislation was viewed by the Episcopalians as the thin edge of popery, which is, by the way, how the Pope refers to his knob. The Episcopal Church had, since the Restoration, relied on the security and protection of the royalist government and the traditional episcopal alliance between church and king. James's religious legislation had now dismantled that alliance, and it allowed other religious denominations the same rights as the established church in Scotland. And people, they were enraged by this religious toleration. Next thing you know, James, he would be introducing gun controls and allowing women control over their reproductive rights. James's religious tolerations, they were like a religious barocca. Everyone was getting more than enough of what they needed. It was as needlessly excessive as a Dubai bottomless brunch. James, he had used the Privy Council to force through his religious reforms, but so appalled were many of its members, 3 refused to sign off on the indulgences, and 2 bishops protested so profusely that they were dismissed from their positions on the Privy Council. Those councillors who did back James's religious reforms, they were mostly Catholic converts who had converted rapidly to boost their political standings. Men such as James and John Drummond, the Earls of Perth and Melfort, and Alexander Stuart, the Earl of Murray. And accusations of Catholic aggrandisement in Scotland were not helped when James fired his leading commissioner in Scotland, William Douglas, the Duke of Queensberry, unofficially for refusing to change his religion. And instead, he gave his Catholic converts powerful positions within the government. James Drummond, the Earl of Perth, was made Lord Chancellor. John Drummond, the Earl of Melfort, and Alexander Stuart, the Earl of Murray, were made Joint Secretaries of State. And Scotland's oldest and most powerful Catholic family, the Gordons, they were given Edinburgh Castle, with the Gordon clan chief, the Duke of Gordon, made Edinburgh Castle Governor. Accusations of popery were furthered when James had the chapel in Holyrood Abbey extensively refurbished for the revival of Scotland's oldest chivalric order, the most ancient and most noble Order of the Thistle. The Order of the Thistle was a boost for Scotland's nobility, but its founding members were comprised mostly of Catholic converts such as Perth, Melfort and Murray. The ornate, very Catholic refurbishment of the chapel included a throne for James and 12 stalls for each of his knights to do coking. Now, if you're not sure of what a chivalric order is, it's essentially a group of knights who abide by medieval concepts of chivalry. This is a kind of code of conduct on how fighting men of the nobility should conduct themselves. The oldest and most famous orders, such as the Knights Templar, were originally founded to protect pilgrims en route to the Holy Land, but by the 17th century, they were essentially a group of powerful men who existed to boost the standing of Scotland's nobility in Europe and to support royal, kingly rule. The establishment of a chivalric order was very royalist, and if by extension not Catholic as such, it was very high church. Basically, the opposite of what Cromwell and the most fervent Covenanters would have found acceptable. The Order of the Thistle, by the way, is still going to this day in Scotland with Charles II at its head. It denotes royalty in Scotland because the thistle's chunky stem and swollen purple head, it reminds the Scottish people of King Charles's fingers because he has very swollen sausage-like fingers. And if you were thinking of anything else, then that's on you, I'm afraid. If you just pictured the king's dick in your head, then you may have just committed treason. Yeah, only Camilla's allowed to do that. That's one of her official titles, Queen Consort and Fondler of the Crown Jewels. There are now 16 knights in the Order of the Thistle. One guy on there, Andrew Bruce, the Earl of Elgin, he's 101 years old. So, presumably not winning the order's annual game of soggy biscuit. There may have been some Catholic conversions amongst the leading members of Scotland's nobility, but James's religious tolerations did not boost Catholic conversions in general. In fact, they had the opposite effect, and they breathed new life into the Presbyterian Church. James's religious tolerations meant the Presbyterian Church was no longer restricted to the extreme edges of the Cameronian praying societies. Presbyterians, they could now meet freely in meeting houses and churches. James's religious tolerations gave, quite ironically, Presbyterians the religious freedom to sing songs at Ibrox about how much they hated Catholics. Moderate Presbyterianism strengthened in the aftermath of James's religious reforms. Ministers who had been expelled to Holland during the Restoration now returned to Scotland, and a solid Presbyterian opposition party began to flourish in Scotland. The Presbyterian Church grew to such an extent as a result of James's religious tolerations that in July 1687, a group of Presbyterian ministers meeting in Edinburgh actually sent the king a thank you letter thanking him for his religious tolerations. James, often acting on the back of some poor advice from Perth, Melfort and Murray, seemed, on the surface at least, to be pursuing a programme of Catholic aggrandisement in Scotland. But the people who were converting to Catholicism were not people who might actually help the Catholic cause in Scotland. It's like how Russell Brand became a Catholic. The Catholic Church messages to me like that. Great. A famous, well-known sex offender has converted to Catholicism. This is just the guy we need to help us with our public image. And James's religious tolerations, aligned with his pro-Catholic actions, were also poorly timed in the larger context of European politics, with the French King Louis XIV ordering the destruction of French Huguenot churches and French Protestant schools in 1685, and Huguenots warning of a French-led counter-reformation. However, despite all the Catholic concern, in Scotland at least, James's rule was secure, and when a revolution did come, it was a solely English endeavour. But it's very easy to get caught up in the religious divisions of the 1680s. It is, in fact, Old Firm supporters' favourite thing in the world to do. And it is these religious divisions that dominate the history books. But it should be remembered that James VII, he did rule over a period of economic prosperity and intellectual enlightenment in Scotland. The Restoration era was a period of paranoia and religious fundamentalism. It's usually remembered as a regressive time, exemplified by the killing time of the 1680s and the persecution of witches in Scotland at this time. But this period of history, it was also a time of intellectual activity that would lay the foundations of the Scottish Enlightenment in the latter half of the 18th century. Some of Scotland's most gifted intellectuals were patronised by James VII, men such as Sir Robert Sibbald, the King's physician, who founded the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh in 1681 and would become the first professor of medicine at Edinburgh University. In 1667, Sibbald planted the Physic Garden at the Trinity College Hospital, where the modern-day Edinburgh Waverley Railway Station stands to this day. And he planted a range of medicinal plants, such as the Calpol plant, to see its effects on human health. The Physic Garden was a forerunner for Edinburgh's botanical gardens. And as a tribute to Sir Robert Sibbald, most of the medicinal plants that come into Edinburgh to this day, they come through Edinburgh Waverley Railway Station. A figure who is perhaps symbolic of the Jekyll and Hyde nature of the era was the Lord Advocate of Scotland, Sir George Mackenzie. Mackenzie was key in stopping witch burnings in Restoration Scotland. Always a cynic, Mackenzie made witch prosecutions almost impossible in Scotland's Central Criminal Court by the end of the 1670s. Mackenzie, he curated Scotland's criminal law into a coherent and philosophical structure, although not even he could explain the rules of rugby. In 1682, as Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, Mackenzie founded the Advocates Library in Edinburgh, which would provide the foundations of the National Library of Scotland, founded in Edinburgh in 1925. But despite his obvious intellectual talents, Sir George Mackenzie is another who is not remembered fondly by the Covenanting historians. Mackenzie, he earned the moniker Bloody Mackenzie from the Covenanters thanks to his scrupulous pursuit and conviction of Cameronian rebels. Mackenzie boasted throughout the killing time that he never lost a case for the king. Mackenzie, he built a library, but he was also responsible for lots and lots of people's deaths. If that library was built using public-private finance, then he's just like Tony Blair. Both he and Sibbald were geniuses within their respective fields, and both published outside of their disciplines. Sibbald published books in cartography, archaeology, and history, and Mackenzie was a celebrated writer of literary prose. And James, as monarch, he gave money to support these men and many other great intellectual minds just like them. James also promoted overseas trade for Scotland. He developed manufactories in Scotland and oversaw an economic boom that saw Glasgow start to become Scotland's largest and most economically viable and important city. However, regardless of the prosperity, enlightenment, and cultural revival of the 1680s, Scotland, it was still a deeply religious society. The 18th century enlightenment that would occur in Scotland, based on inquiry, reason, and scientific principles, it simply would not have been possible amongst the religiosity of 17th century Scottish society. And ultimately, it was religion that would prove to be James's downfall. James's promotion of dignitaries to high positions of power in government were more pronounced in England than in Scotland. In England, James appointed Catholics to positions of power within the government, English universities, the armed forces, and the church. And just as it happened in Scotland, the English Parliament acted against the king's wishes and refused to repeal the anti-Catholic laws in England. And, again, just like it happened in Scotland, James' response to this was to dissolve the Parliament and force through a Catholic indulgence in April 1687 that suspended all the penal laws against Catholics as well as Protestant dissenters. And again, just like in Scotland, it was the established church that James's indulgences would anger the most. Even the most high church Anglican members of the Church of England viewed James's religious indulgences as an attempt to establish a national Catholic church in England. In April 1688, a year after the initial issuing of the religious legislation, James ordered its reissue and demanded that the indulgence be distributed widely and insisted all bishops in the Church of England announce the indulgence from their pulpits. Only 200 of England's clergymen obeyed the king's demands. 7 bishops, led by William Sancroft, the Archbishop of Canterbury, denounced the declaration, and they were imprisoned in the Tower of London for sedition as a result, although they were later released and found not guilty. James's Protestant subjects' anxieties were increased when Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a male heir in June 1688. Mary, she had suffered several miscarriages and the death of 5 children in infancy, and most thought at the age of 40 years old that she was incapable of bearing children. But then, on the 10th of June 1688, at St James's Palace in London, Mary gave birth to a healthy male heir, Prince James Francis Edward Stuart. Now, up to that point, James's Catholic moves in England were tolerable up to a point, because all the Protestants had to do was wait for the king to die. James was already 51 years old when he ascended to the thrones. And when James died, the heir apparent, James's daughter Mary, she would become queen. And then England would have a Protestant monarch once again. But now, with the birth of the Prince of Wales, of Prince James Francis Edward Stuart, England, it now had a Catholic successor, and England was facing a continuing Catholic line through the Prince of Wales. And in the 17th century, the birth of a Catholic member of the royal family was as unthinkable as, the birth of a mixed race member of the royal family is to readers of the Daily Mail in the 21st century. And so it proved to be the final straw for English Protestants. The birth of a Catholic male heir, it set the wheels of revolution in motion. Mary, the heir apparent before James Francis Edward Stuart's birth, she was married to William of Orange, the Stadtholder of Holland, and the revered protector of Protestantism in Europe. Now, from a Dutch perspective, a Catholic England would almost certainly ally with Louis XIV's France, and it would overrun Protestant Holland. And so, William, he made discreet overtures to those men of, inverted commas, goodwill and honest standing in England, that he would be willing to intervene in England to protect its nationhood and religion. Incidentally, by the way, protecting my religion, an absolutely cracking REM B-side. A foreign leader willing to actively get involved in British politics in an attempt to overthrow the established leadership. William of Orange was like the original Vladimir Putin. Several of England's highest dignitaries sent word to William, making it clear that his intervention in English politics would be well received. And so, on the 5th of November 1688, acting on an invitation from several of England's leading figures, William landed in the southwest of England, and his revolution, remembered by Whig historians as the Glorious Revolution, which is also how I refer to my cartwheels, it had begun. And it is the Glorious Revolution that we are going to cover in the next episode of the Mountebank History of Scotland series. So that brings us to the end of the episode. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, just do the usual that I ask you to do every week. Please like the video, become a subscriber, and help me grow the channel. Give me a wee follow on social media as well. I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Mountebank Scotland. I just put out like funny wee videos about Scottish history, stand-up clips, all that sort of stuff on there. If you find yourself in Edinburgh, the beautiful city of Edinburgh, and you want to come on a walking tour, you can do my comedy walking tour of the city or my comedy whiskey tasting. That's all bookable via my website, which is in the link description. And yeah, that actually brings us to the end of this series of the Mountebank History of Scotland. I'll be back after the Edinburgh Fringe Festival with some new episodes. We're going to pick up where we left off to this day. Seems like a good place to stop there, the beginnings of the Glorious Revolution and all the big set-piece moments of Scottish history we've got to look forward to. The Glorious Revolution, the Act of Union, and the Jacobite rebellions. We're going to come on to all that stuff later on in the year. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed this series. Please help me grow it. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. And I'll see you all later in the year. Cheerio! Bye-bye!